Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, but more specifically, we're going to be discussing the Bitcoin dominance. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I think we are about to enter into the final crescendo of the Bitcoin dominance rally. The Bitcoin dominance rally is something that we've been talking about for approximately 3 years. We anticipated it well in advance, and the basis for it was essentially the fundamental understanding of hey, the Fed is going to have to significantly tighten monetary policy, and when that happens, it's going to lead to a flight to safety trade within each asset class. Okay? Now, for things like the stock market, that has resulted in the Magnificent Seven. For the cryptocurrency industry, it has resulted in people fleeing smaller market cap coins in favor of higher market cap coins. That does not mean that none of these smaller market cap alts have outperformed Bitcoin. In fact, some of them have. And that's actually part of the thesis that we outlined long ago, is that some of the alts will outperform Bitcoin even during a Bitcoin dominance rally. But that should not subtract the validity of the theory in the first place. Just because there are a few exceptions to the rule does not mean that the dominance of Bitcoin is not going up. And we've actually seen that play out fairly well over the last several years. Now, one of the things that's interesting about all of this is that when did dominance even bottom? Because if you look at it, if you look at just Bitcoin dominance, including stablecoins, you'll notice that it didn't really bottom until September of 2022, which is interesting. That's actually quite a bit later in the cycle than it normally does. In fact, in the prior cycle, Bitcoin dominance bottomed in January of 2018 at the beginning of the bear market. But this time, Bitcoin dominance did not bottom until just before the bear market had ended. And I guess one of the reasons for that is because of the hype around the merge for Ethereum. That's at least what I think the narrative will likely be remembered as. However, we must remember one key thing about Bitcoin dominance. The reason we talk about it is to fundamentally understand alt Bitcoin valuations, not stablecoins and the stablecoin market cap. So, when you think about it like that, and you think like, okay, well, if Bitcoin dominance put in a new low in September of 2022, then wouldn't that mean ETH Bitcoin would have put in a new high? But it didn't, right? It didn't put in a new high in September. It was a lower high. And in fact, the altcoin market collectively, right? If you look at the altcoin market collectively, it put in a lower high in September of 2022. So then why, when we look at the Bitcoin dominance chart, do we see a chart that did not bottom until September of 2022? Well, the reason is because of the stablecoin market cap. The stablecoin market cap, so that the top of Bitcoin occurred right here. But the stablecoin market cap continued to go up through May of 2022. So because of that, right, because the stablecoin, and this is just an approximation of the stablecoin market cap, this is USDT, USDC, DAI, and BUSD, because that continued to go up another 27%, that's the reason why dominance did not bottom, including stablecoins, until September of 2022. Now, we can come up with an approximation to ignore stablecoins, and that would be this right here. And when you come up with this, right, this is the dominance of Bitcoin times total market cap, divided by total minus USDC, USDT, DAI, and BUSD. So we're subtracting out the stablecoin market cap. We're pretending like those stablecoins just don't even exist when we add up what the total market cap of the cryptocurrency industry is. And when you do that, you come up with something that looks a lot different. Instead of a chart, right, instead of a chart that looks like this, where dominance didn't bottom until September of 2022, you get a chart that shows you that Bitcoin dominance actually bottomed in May of 2021, right? So there's a difference, right? There's a difference between what the including stablecoin dominance tells you and the excluding stablecoin dominance tells you. And when you exclude when you exclude stablecoins, what you'll see is a fairly steady uptrend by dominance, where every time it hits this lower bound, people start to get a little bit nervous if you're following the Bitcoin dominance train, right? If you've just decided to stick with Bitcoin mostly over the altcoin market, obviously you would want to see the Bitcoin dominance go up. And again, this is one of those things where it's not a reflection, honestly, of my view on the altcoin market. It's just a reflection of monetary policy, right? It was never personal with the altcoin market. It's not like back in early 2022. It's not like I had it out for the altcoin market. It's just I said back then, I came up with a video, tips for navigating the bear market, and I said back then that alts not only will they do poorly in a bear market, but they'll even underperform Bitcoin whenever Bitcoin starts to go back up until the Fed pivots to quantitative easing and a lower rates, which hasn't happened yet, right? And so it then sort of brings up this question, right, of, well, why hasn't the altcoin market broken down? Because I've been going on and on about this. Honestly, I'm sick of it myself. Just making these videos, I just get kind of annoyed with, and I hear myself say it because I feel like I have to. It's sort of like the persona at this point. But I personally am sick of the narrative. But you have to trade the market that you have, not the market that you want. And when I look at alt Bitcoin pairs, I do see a very similar move that we had last cycle, where alt Bitcoin pairs, come back down to about 40%. They spend about a year there, and then eventually they break support, right? That is what happened last cycle. Now, you can see that we've had a couple of close calls where it looked like alt Bitcoin pairs were about to collapse, right? In April, and then again in June. But I wonder if the reason they didn't was because rate cuts were not yet likely going to arrive within the next month or so. And the reason I say that is because if you overlay interest rates onto the chart, you will notice that when the Fed cut in July of 2019, it was just before those rate cuts that alt Bitcoin pairs finally broke support. Just before the first rate cut. Now, you could argue that cause and effect, right? Did alt Bitcoin pairs drop because the Fed cut rates, or the Fed was going to cut rates, or did alt Bitcoin pairs drop, or did the Fed cut rates because alt Bitcoin pairs dropped? Now, let's get one thing straight. The Fed doesn't care about your altcoins, right? They don't. And if you look at these charts and you don't like the narrative about alt Bitcoin pairs being oscillators, then let's pretend like your altcoins are the ones that are going to outperform Bitcoin forever, and that I'm talking about someone else's altcoins, right? As everyone says, right? If it's an altcoin that you don't own, it's a scam, right? That's what the general reflection is, I think, in the crypto community. I think it's a really bad reflection, but there's also this like cult-like mentality that often kind of boils up. Whereas if you don't own that alt and someone's talking about it, that must mean you're shilling it, which is just kind of an unfair place to be. But when I look at this chart, I can't help but feel like alts are oscillators at best, And if that is the case, then it means that they're likely going to drop to about 0.25. And they're right now they're at 0.4. Now, get the eye rolls out of the way. I've been saying it forever. I know. It still hasn't happened. I know. Maybe it won't happen. I could be wrong. It certainly wouldn't be the first time I'm wrong about something, right? We know that. It wouldn't be the first time. But I wonder, is it because the Fed was not yet going to cut rates? Now, again, I don't think the Fed cares about the altcoin market. But I do think that if alts are breaking down against Bitcoin, it might be the first warning shot that the economy is starting, the consumer is showing some weakness. It's the warning shot, right? And that's why I wonder if we are about to witness it drop in August, in the month of August. And the reason I say that is because we know last cycle, alt Bitcoin pairs finally dropped 1 month before the first rate cut. Now, unfortunately, I don't know when the first rate cut is going to be. You could make a case that the Fed could cut in July. You could. I mean, it doesn't look like they're going to. If we just reload this page, there's only a 6.7% chance they're going to cut, and that's only a week away, right? It's not like it's that far away. I mean, you're talking about July 31st, and I'm recording this video on July 24th. So, unless something drastic happens between now and then, they're likely not going to cut. Now, there are things that could make them cut between now and then. For instance, if the S&P 500 were to get a sustained sell-off between now and then, maybe that would cause them to cut. And you can see that it is dropping, at least right now. So if that drop were to continue, then maybe it would throw in a token cut. I don't know, right? I really don't. And I think that we're fooling ourselves into pretending that we can know exactly what the market's going to do. But I will say that, if you get a situation where alt Bitcoin pairs break down like now instead of in August, then maybe they will cut in July, which again is only a week away. Now, I don't think it makes sense to go into the July meeting at this point with the assumption that they're going to cut. But if you start to see alt Bitcoin pairs give way before August, then maybe that's a sign that the Fed would cut before August or before the September meeting. So perhaps that's the way to think about it, right? The other thing that, is kind of happening quietly right now is that the 10-year yield is at 4.235. The 2-year is at 4.4. We're less than 20 basis points away from an uninverted 2-year, 10-year yield. Less than 20 basis points. What if it uninverts before the July meeting? Could that be a reason for the Fed to cut? Maybe. Now, one argument would be that if the Fed does cut in July, does that mean that alt Bitcoin pairs don't capitulate? My argument would still be that they would. One of the reasons for that is that even last cycle, when the Fed cut, alt Bitcoin pairs still went down for 2 more months until September. Okay? And we've talked about this 2019 comparison forever, but we know that they went down until September. Furthermore, we also know that alt Bitcoin pairs did not bottom until QE began, right? And I think I thought I pulled this up. And you can see it pretty clearly here, right? This purple, let me change it to a different color so it's not blending in with the other one. You can see it pretty clearly, right? When the Fed expanded their balance sheet, altcoins bottomed against Bitcoin. It was as simple as that, right? You could have just stayed Bitcoin heavy and just ignored the altcoin market. Some alts would have gone up a lot and you would have been mad, right? But that's what you could have done. You could have said, I'm just going to stick with Bitcoin. It's safer. I don't want the stress of dealing with which alt's getting rugged this week. Furthermore, guys, if you're holding an alt that's durably outperforming Bitcoin, like if it's in higher lows against Bitcoin or holding its lows, I'm not saying you should go trade it for Bitcoin. At this point, if you haven't gotten on the Bitcoin dominance train by now, I don't know what to tell you. The time to get on it was 2.5 years ago, not right now. But, of course, if you're a Bitcoin maxi, you would argue it's never too late. And I don't really consider myself a Bitcoin maxi, but I also do think Bitcoin exists in a class of its own. It's almost like I think that in terms of portfolio management, it would make sense sort of separate out. You have your Bitcoin portfolio, and then you have your everything else portfolio. So I look at this, and I'm like, well, alt Bitcoin pairs got a pretty big scare in April and in June. And it was actually when Bitcoin was dropping. It was actually when Bitcoin was getting rejected from the range highs, right? If you sort of draw the line up, it was when Bitcoin had just gotten rejected off of these range highs that alt Bitcoin pairs sold off. And so if it happens again, where alt Bitcoin pairs sell off, when would that be? Well, notice this one was in April and the next one was in June. If you just continue the pattern, July, August, right? It'd be in August. So, which coincidentally is 1 month before the first Fed rate cut if they go in September. Now, if they go in July, then maybe something different would happen, right? But But again, even last cycle when the Fed cut in July, the altcoin market still went down against Bitcoin for about 2 more months. Okay? It wasn't until the Fed pivoted from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. We also know that the Fed reduced the rate at which they're reducing their balance sheet, right? They dropped it by about 25 billion. And if you look at this blue line, you can see that once upon a time there was this well-defined slope, and it kind of seems like we're coming off of that slope a little bit. And it's because they're not reducing their balance sheet as quickly as they were. And I think the reason is just to allow for inflation to get durably back to target, to allow more time, essentially to buy the Fed a little bit more time for inflation to get to target. So here we are, right? It's July 24th. The Fed, maybe they cut in July. It's not the most likely outcome. And again, I think I'm going to go into this assuming they're going to cut in September. But if they cut in July, it would probably be due to something happening between now and then. And it could be something as simple as like the S&P just, continues to sell off, right? Something like that. Like if you were to look at like monthly returns on the S&P, if the S&P were to just continue to sell off between now and next Wednesday, then perhaps that would usher in a rate cut. But if it were to play out like the market is expecting, then the expectation would be that all Bitcoin pairs are about to finally meet their fate just before the rate cut part of the cycle begins. And that would imply that altcoins still have another 37% drop against Bitcoin. Now, that could come either on a Bitcoin rally or a Bitcoin dump. I don't know. I can't know. I wish I did know. I know that the last 2 drops by alt Bitcoin pairs in April and June were on Bitcoin drops, on Bitcoin dumps, not on Bitcoin rallies. But I know that in June of 2019, when alt Bitcoin pairs finally broke down, it was on a Bitcoin rally 1 month before the first rate cut. So there does exist a scenario where Bitcoin rallies even into August, and maybe it even takes out the prior high for all we know. And that's what causes alt Bitcoin pairs to break down. Again, it's not so clear because other metrics that we would normally look at, like when gold broke out in 2019, that already occurred, and that's what marked the mid-cycle top in 2019. If you were to look at USDT dominance, right? I mean, it already tagged a trend line back in March, and now, in fact, it's trying to hold its bull market support band at support at also sort of these higher lows. It's always possible it comes back down to this trend line, just like it did in 2021, though, so I can't completely discount that idea. And what's interesting is if it were, this was made in November, if it does it again, it'd be March to August. So there's an example, there's a sort of an example where you could see it go back down to the trend line where Bitcoin puts in a new all-time high, but the altcoin market does not, and total market cap does not, just simply because that liquidity from the altcoin market has just made its way over to Bitcoin. If you don't believe me in that these ideas have any validity, look at Bitcoin here. You see where it is? It's at the same price it's been at since March, for the most part. If you just ignore sort of the deviations kind of outside of this range, it's been in this range between 60 and 70K, more or less, for about 4 to 5 months. Now, where does the altcoin market stack up? Right? Where does Total 3? It's still putting in lower highs, and it hasn't even taken out its 20-week moving average. So, that's sort of one of those things where even in 2019, we saw alt Bitcoin pairs durably drop below the 20-week SMA before Bitcoin did. And they did it in July, and here they did it in June. And if they were to follow 2019, then it would imply that they eventually fade even further to the downside. Which, again, I don't know. And that's going to be dependent on if it's on a Bitcoin rally or a Bitcoin dump. What's fascinating is that while Bitcoin is still at 65K, or 66K, almost 67K. Alts are not, right? Look at Polkadot. I mean, in March, it was $12. Now it's like $6. It's half off. Look at Cardano. In March, it was 80 cents. Now it's 40 cents. 50% down. Look at Avalanche. Where was it in March? $64. Now it's $30. More than 50% down. A lot of these alts are going through this. Not all of them. Matic is more than 50% down. In March, it was 128. Now it's 53 cents. XRP in March was hit 70 something cents. Now it's at 63, right? It's not doing as badly as some of the other ones. Link is not doing as badly, but it's still down, right? From $23 down to 13. Even Doge, right? Even Doge from 20, 22, 23 cents. Now it's at 13 cents. You know, poor Litecoin couldn't get above its bull market support, man, save its life at this point, it feels like. Maybe it will eventually, but, you know, I mean, it's just one of these things where Litecoin, it just, you know, it's probably spends more time below its 20-week estimate than it does above it. Now, Solana has obviously done better. Right? Back in March, it was at 200 something. Now it's at 178. So again, I'm not saying that. I mean, look at Uni. What was it back over here in March? $16. Now it's less than 8. So you can see how there's been this rotation away from alts and into Bitcoin. It doesn't mean that all alts are doing this, but a majority of them are, and you know that's true because you can just simply look at the dominance of Bitcoin and say, well, you know, after all this time, it looks like it's just still trending above its bull market support band, and it's not even that far away from putting in a new high. What's interesting is the last time dominance put in a new high was in April. But there's an interesting way that you can look at this. Take out Ethereum from the dominance calculation. Bitcoin divided by, in parentheses, total minus ETH. If you look at it like that, dominance just put on a new high in June. Right? Alts keep on bleeding back to Bitcoin and have gone to new lows even in June. You can tell pretty easily by looking at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin and seeing pretty clearly that they just put in a new low in June. So again, it's an interesting thing. There is a counterpoint to my view about this being the same thing. This is total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. If you just look at total 3 divided by Bitcoin, you could argue that we've sort of tagged that level we hit in 2018 before we got a larger bounce. But actually, when it tagged that level in 2018, we were in a bear market, you know? And while the bounce occurred, it didn't occur because alts were going up on their USD pairs. It occurred because they were just going down, but not as quickly as Bitcoin was, right? Now, again, I mean, it's hard for me to look at this and say that it's the same thing because when you subtract out, when you go over here and you subtract out, one of the larger stable coins, it kind of looks like we've already gone through this whole process, and that now it's finally starting to break down, right? That's what it looks like to me. Okay. And if you were to look at total 2 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, which again, this includes ETH, the other one did not, I mean, you can see that it's been on a fairly steady decline for a while now. I mean, it does look like it's starting to round out a little bit, right? And that's why I think Bitcoin dominance is likely going to top within, probably in the second half of 2024. I would say January 2025 at the latest, given what I know now. But again, my view could change. It could. But given what I know now, I think the first main time that Bitcoin dominance, the earliest I could see it topping, is September. And the way I could see it being September is because a lot of times in September, Bitcoin dominance makes a U-turn, right? Here's September of 2022, right? Here is September of 2023. September of 2021. You can see that whatever Bitcoin dominance is doing leading into September, it normally reverses out of it the other way, right? And you can see that happen, time and time again. And here, right? So if we get a scenario where dominance shoots up before September, then maybe it tops in September. Kind of like it did in 2019, right? This was in September of 2019. Now, for it to top in September, I think you need rate cuts, as early as July. Because that would be kind of what happened last cycle. You get a rate cut in July, a couple months later, maybe they pivot over to QE, then maybe you see dominance top in September. But given the market probabilities right now, that doesn't look like the most likely outcome. And if they don't pivot until September, then 2 months after that is November, right? So then that would be sort of the next candidate. But the other thing to remember is that the main reason Bitcoin dominance would see a big push would be the devaluation of ETH against Bitcoin, which has been the one thing that everyone's been touting as it's been holding up well for so long. And here we are, after the spot ETF, how many people have this on their bingo card? That ETH Bitcoin would just bleed. Look at this. It bled into Bitcoin's ETF, and it bled into its own ETF. I keep saying the deflationary stuff, the proof of stake stuff, it doesn't matter. Bitcoin is a safer asset. It's where money is going to go until looser monetary policy arrives. It's not a reflection of my views on Ethereum. I like Ethereum. I think Ethereum's going to do great things. I think it's going to go to way higher prices eventually. But it needs to outperform Bitcoin for me to be interested in it. If it's just going to keep on bleeding, why would I buy that when I could just stick with something that's lower risk like Bitcoin and get better returns? How many of the gurus had that on their bingo card? That this is what would happen. Remember, in 2016, if you ignore monetary policy, ETH Bitcoin also had a similar sweep of the low halfway through the year. Right? And then guess what, right? It moved up for a while. And it went up until September, right? I'm not here to tell you that it has to immediately drop. In fact, last cycle, ETH Bitcoin didn't break support until the Fed cut rates, right? Until the Fed cut rates. The Fed hasn't cut rates yet. And, you know, if they cut rates this month, then maybe ETH Bitcoin breaks support this month. But if they don't cut till September, that still gives ETH Bitcoin 2 more months. There is a chance, right? There's a chance that it gets a push back up to sweep this high in a couple of months. Yeah, that's what it did in 2016, right? It came up, came back down, and then swept the high in September, and then it sold off. Took 3 months after that, October, November, December, and then it finally bottomed out. So we could see a scenario where it still could get another bounce. Right? It's possible. I'm not saying it's the most likely outcome, but it's possible. And if it happens like that, it should not detract from the Bitcoin dominance view. Because you can see that ultimately what eventually happened in Q4, which typically favors Bitcoin over ETH, is that ETH Bitcoin finally capitulated. So I don't know. I don't know if it's going to play out like that or if it's going to follow more sort of the 2019 path where, you know, you sort of get this rally. See this green candle here that ETH Bitcoin got in February 2019, and then it had 2 red candles following that. It kind of looks similar, right? Where you get this big candle up, and then the 2 red candles that follow it kind of bleed back down. And then the following month, which was May, which was 1 month before the first rate cut, it was a small green candle with wicks on either side to the top part of the range and the bottom part of the range. You see that? So if it did that in August, you could have something like that where you get a candle that wicks all the way down to less than 0.05, and it wicks all the way back up to 0.057 if it follows what we did in May of 2019, 1 month before the first rate cut. Or no, 2 months. That was 2 months before the first rate cut. Right, so you can see. But guess what? Then you had June, July, August, bottom in September. So if it follows that, you know, if next month, if in August, it's just a long wick in either direction, then you could have September break support, which is when it did, you know, when it started to collapse in 2016. And also September would be when the Fed could cut rates. And then you got September, October, November, bottom in December. Bitcoin dominance top in December, which coincidentally, if you look at alt Bitcoin pair 12-month candles, guess what you see? You see every 4 years, alt Bitcoin pairs surge against Bitcoin, right? That's your alt season. You know, I've spent the last 3 years being the bad guy because I wasn't willing to call it an alt season. But the reality that no one wants to hear is that, and again, it took me so long to realize this, and I've been in crypto for a long time. The reality is that altcoins spend about 3 years of the 4-year cycle going down against Bitcoin, and then they spend 1 year going up, right? This is alt season here, right? This is alt season. This is not alt season, right? Just like that wasn't alt season either. That's not what alt season looks like. What alt season looks like is when alts are durably outperforming Bitcoin while Bitcoin's going up. And that hasn't been happening. Bitcoin's been going up, but guess what? Alts haven't been able to keep pace. Now, you could argue, well, what about the Russell, right? I mean, the Russell against the NASDAQ has started to show a little bit of strength here. And you're right. You're right. It has. Who knows if that's going to be more sustainable or not, right? I mean, you can see that has been a fairly large move by alt Bitcoin, or sorry, by, alt companies against the NASDAQ. And it looks like they've sort of broken through here, right? But we also know that they had a similar, they've had similar rallies before where they break above the bull market support band. And then back then when that occurred, that rally off the low, it was about a 13-14% move. And so far this one has been about a 17% move. We've seen rallies like this before, but they were still premature. So maybe you see alt Bitcoin pairs do that. But here's the thing, though. With the Russell, you can see that it actually did have a capitulation against the NASDAQ, a while back, right? I mean, like, if you look at, like, the Russell against the NASDAQ, I mean, this drop below the range lows occurred back in May of 2023, and the Russell dropped considerably against the NASDAQ, right? It dropped 25% already, whereas alt Bitcoin pairs have not. So what are the chances that alt Bitcoin pairs finally give way into the last few months of the year, and then Bitcoin reclaims that market share, and then Bitcoin dominance goes to approximately 60%? One of the interesting things about Bitcoin dominance is that if you look at last cycle, and if you look at what happened last cycle, what you'll notice is that the fib retracement, they retraced to the 0.618 fib. You see? That's where they went to. And I've said before, I think that could happen again. And if you take it from here and you go down to the bottom, the 0.618 fib is at 60%. And now I came up with a 60% view before I even looked at this stuff. The reason I said 60% was just because that's basically returning back to where this whole thing started, back in April of 2021. Or March and April of 2021. That's when this whole thing started. And a lot of times these moves sort of return back to where they initially had that major breakdown from. Now, last cycle, what we saw is we actually saw Bitcoin USD go up until Bitcoin dominance broke through the 0.5 fib. And that's why I said at the beginning of this year, risk on until 56% Bitcoin dominance. You guys remember that, right? Risk on until 56% Bitcoin dominance. Well, we went above 56% back in April. But we haven't had any weekly closes above it. Maybe we'll get one. And if we do, perhaps it would signal a transition to risk off. I don't, it's hard for me to know. That's just what happened last cycle, right? If you overlay Bitcoin USD onto this chart, what you'll see is that last cycle, when dominance made it to the 0.5 fib, that's precisely where Bitcoin USD it topped out and it started to put in lower highs. So we already did go there, but it was only a wick. We also haven't actually taken out that level yet either, back in March. So I think that, the move from 56% to 60% is going to be that final crescendo. And you could see it play out like this, right? You could see dominance spike to 57 to 58% in August, followed by maybe a pullback in September, and then maybe going up to 60% by the end of the year. You could also see 60% by September. That's possible, especially if the Fed cuts in July. It's just impossible to know if and when they're going to cut. And I don't know. I just defer to the market. And, a few years ago, I did not defer to the market. I said interest rates are going to 5.5%, even when most people are telling you there's no way in hell they're going to go that high. And I also said they'd stay there for a long time. A lot of people said the economy couldn't handle it. And yeah, here we are. So many years later, we've been at 5.5% for a year now, because the Fed paused July 2023. here we are, right? And we still don't even have a rate cut, and we might not even get one this month either, because it's only 1 month away. So with Bitcoin dominance, there's certainly a lot to consider. It's how do you construct your portfolio? And I've said before, right? Bitcoin heavy until dominance is at much higher levels. I also think, by the way, and I've said this before, I think dominance will top before Bitcoin gets a more durable drop below its bull market support band, right? And we've had a couple of instances where people were like, well, you said dominance was going to top before Bitcoin fell below its 20-week moving average. But you can see that in both cases, we've gotten back above it. So maybe these were just fake outs that made people think that dominance had topped, but in reality, it has not. I do think it has at least one more push left in it. I think a lot of it will come on the back of ETH Bitcoin dropping. I think there's a chance that ETH Bitcoin could sweep the high up here again, especially after the selling pressure from the ETHE, from the spot ETF stuff. After that subsides, maybe it can go back up. But you could also have a wick down before it bounces, right? You could have a wick down before it actually bounces, kind of like what happened just before rate cuts in 2019, right? There was a wick down, it bounced, and then it sold off. And you can, one of the things about dominance including stables, right? If we pull up dominance including stables, what you'll see is that even in 2019, right, there was a period where, it came back up and it swept the prior high. And then after sweeping it, it pulled back, put in a higher low, kind of back tested this, and then went up. Now look at it today, right? You can see here, it sort of swept the high. It then came back down here, potentially back testing this, and then it's just continued to move up. Bitcoin dominance this year has never stopped putting in higher lows, right? And what's fascinating about it, what's fascinating that should get your attention, because coming into this year, it was not a popular view to say Bitcoin dominance would go higher, right? I received a lot of crap from people for saying that. They're like, well, every other halving year dominance goes down. Look at 2016 and 2020, right? Dominance went down. Look at 2024. Dominance has been going up, higher lows basically since this year began. This is different than what you've seen in other halving years. And I think the reason is because monetary policy is more restrictive today than it was in 2020 and 2016. In fact, in 2016, interest rates were extremely close to zero, right? What were they like? I don't even know. I don't even remember. Like 25 basis points, 0.25. What were they? Back over here. 0.5? Yeah, they're 0.5%, right? So monetary policy was nowhere near that restrictive back then. Unless that's actually another topic. We won't get into that right now, but some people would argue that it was restrictive for the time. But not that restrictive. Today, it's a lot more restrictive. So, when you look at this stuff and you're like, all right, well, because Bitcoin dominance went down in 2016 and 2020, a lot of people sort of just assume it's going to go down in 2024. But this shows you that monetary policy matters in this instance, right? It shows you that it's important, because if it weren't important, then why didn't dominance go down in Q2? Now, I've said before, there is a window here where dominance could show some weakness, right? And it's the July to August timeframe. That is the weakness window. So, and even early September. So if you are a Bitcoin dominance bear, this is your chance is now to get it to go down. Like, this is your chance to get it to go down, because this is the weakest part of the window. For on average, if you look at the last couple of halving years, right? If you average out 2016 and 2020 Bitcoin dominance, and you then just remove the 2016, 2020, you just look at the average, right? This would be where you would expect some weakness if you don't believe in the monetary policy side of things affecting the crypto market. And you can see it back over here, right? The fact that there was some weakness here did allow, did pull dominance down, but it never really stopped putting in higher lows for the most part, right? That's what I'm saying. Like, I'm not going to sit up here and say that you can't have any more weakness by it. Like, it's not like ETH Bitcoin can't get a bounce. Maybe it goes sub 0.05. It could go back out to 0.049. Everyone freaks out, then it bounces again and then sells off a month or two later. But this shows you, right? This shows you that monetary policy plays a role, and that the tighter monetary policy is, the higher dominance should theoretically go. It's a flight to safety. It doesn't mean Bitcoin can't go down. We just saw it go down basically 4 months in a row. Lower highs and lower lows. But guess what? Now Bitcoin's back at 66K. Where the hell is the altcoin market, right? Half of them are probably half off. So I think the window for the rest of the year for dominance to show any weakness, if it's going to, is now. But it's not. That's sort of the... And if you go back and watch my last dominance video, this is what I said. I said, like, sort of the window for it to happen, if it's gonna show weakness, would be, July, August, if it's gonna follow prior halving years. But it's not doing that. It's not following that. Instead, it looks more like it's following kind of like these prior years where dominance was going up and monetary policy was restrictive, like 2019. And here you have Bitcoin, at 67K. Here's the great thing about dominance. If Bitcoin gets rejected from the range highs, let's say it goes up, and gets rejected up here. The last 2 times it did, we saw all Bitcoin pairs aggressively sell off. If Bitcoin breaks out and puts in a new high before rate cuts, like in 2019, breaking out would likely also lead to dominance going higher. Because if you were to overlay Bitcoin dominance onto this chart in 2023, when Bitcoin USD broke out, right? As it led up into that breakout, right? Bitcoin dominance was putting in new highs and going parabolic. You see that? Now, yes, it did get a sell-off after that, but as it made that move, right? As it made that move into those new highs, Bitcoin dominance put in new highs, new cycle highs. So the way I look at it, I'm like, it doesn't really matter if Bitcoin puts in new highs or if it, puts in a new local low. It doesn't matter. Either way, right? Either way, Bitcoin dominance is likely going to go up, especially when you look at it in a few months. That's my view. And I've stood by this view for 3 years. We're almost done. I think we're almost done. I think Bitcoin dominance will get one more push up. I think it'll go to around 60%, and that'll be it. Let's not nickel and dime me if it goes to 59 or 61, right? I don't know exactly where it's going to top, assuming the top's not in. But that is what my expectation would be. Now, there does exist a scenario where dominance has already topped. And it's because of that I say the views that I expressed in this video, I don't really think they're necessarily something that you can act on now in good conscience. Because, the dominance rally has been going on for 3 years already. I mean, it has. So it's not like I'm saying, if you've held your alts all the way down against Bitcoin so far, you run the risk of just being the person that capitulates at the alt Bitcoin low. There's also this other reality, though, of a lot of alt Bitcoin pairs just keep putting in new lows forever once they reach a certain phase of their cycle. The newer alts tend to outperform. The older alts tend to underperform. So, yes, there's a chance I'm wrong. And if I am, so be it. I will pivot if I am. But every reason that made me bullish on Bitcoin dominance to begin with hasn't changed. Right? It hasn't changed yet. I can see the end of the tunnel, though. Like, I see the monetary policy is likely about to change in the next few months. And so that's why I think, it doesn't really make sense to go like, and I even said this on ETH Bitcoin back when it was at like 0.045. I was like, guys, look, I'm not convinced that ETH Bitcoin is bottomed here. I think it will eventually go lower. It's silly to wait this entire downturn and then make the trade, because then you run the risk of this happening, right? You get a big bounce up and then you have to spend the next several months wondering if you capitulated the bottom. This is more for academic purposes at this point. All right. The time to take action on this stuff, in my opinion, was 3 years ago. Not, in the last 3 to 6 months, potentially, of the Bitcoin dominance rally. I think the time to do so would have been several years ago. That's my view. If you've held on this long, I'm not going to be the person to tell you that you should give up on that alt, because there is a good chance that once looser monetary policy arrives, just like in 2017 and 2021, we saw alt Bitcoin pairs rally in the post-halving year, which is only half a year away. So that's my view on Bitcoin dominance. I hope I've articulated it as well as I can, but those are my views. I do not apologize for them. If you have a problem with it, so be it. All I was trying to do was help people preserve the Satoshi valuation of their portfolio. And the reason I did so was because I saw the Satoshi valuation of my portfolio get wrecked in prior cycles, because I just speculated on all these altcoins, and then they just ended up bleeding back to Bitcoin in the end. And I did have a few alts that did outperform Bitcoin last cycle, and I talked about them. But I also think as investors, we kind of we grow, we mature. At some point, we're just like, you know what? I don't want to take on that risk necessarily, right? I just want to preserve what I have, and just sticking with Bitcoin through the through the good times and the bad times, just a lot less risk than the altcoin market can often be. And sure, it's easy. I mean, it's easy today and look at things, and say, well, yeah, like had you just bought that at the bottom, you'd be up 10x or 50x or something. But the reality is there's so many alts that did not do that. There's so many that have not outperformed Bitcoin. It's just that we focus on the few that did to try to convince us that the strategy is wrong, when in reality, it's never been wrong. It's been right. It's just that because alt Bitcoin pairs have been bleeding so slowly, a lot of people just haven't noticed. But they've never stopped going down, considering they just put in a new low in June 17th of 2024. And what's really interesting is, if you were bearish on Bitcoin dominance, if you were bullish on all Bitcoin pairs, I mean, legitimately, you would have been wrong unless you just switched your view in June. And I honestly don't know many people who were bearish on all Bitcoin pairs until June and then decided they were now bullish, right? Because nothing has really changed. The only thing that could change is if you get a rate cut. But even then, last cycle, it still took QE before all Bitcoin pairs bottomed. The other thing to look at here is Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance. I've said 73% is a huge milestone for a long time. That's the milestone. Once it durably broke, that's right before the Fed cut rates. And you can see that it's right there. The same thing with Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance. It's at that same level it was at just before the Fed cut rates last cycle. A lot of these things are playing out in a very similar fashion. Very, very similar, right? There's 60%. That's exactly where it was, right? In June of 2019, just before the Fed cut. And you can see there were some false breakouts back here too, before you had a more durable breakout to the top of the range. So it seems like it's all playing out. And even others Bitcoin, which excludes the top 10, I mean, look, it hasn't really, even since when 2024 began, everyone was saying, like, you're not looking at others Bitcoin. You're only looking at total 3 Bitcoin. Look at others. Well, I'm looking, and all I see is that it's been going lower for the entire year. That's all I see. And remember, last cycle, it dropped 60%, climbed 60, dropped 60 as rate cuts arrived. Dropped 60, climbed 60, dropped 60 as rate cuts arrived. And it's already down 30%. It's already down 30%. So this is why Bitcoin dominance is important, right? If Bitcoin rallies to a new high, it's going to likely break all Bitcoin pairs down like 2019. If Bitcoin gets rejected at another lower high, right? If it gets rejected from another lower high like 2019, then you still likely see alt Bitcoin pairs capitulate, because the last 2 times it got rejected from 70K plus or minus a couple of K, alt Bitcoin pairs sold off aggressively. So no matter how you look at it, dominance is likely going to go up. So the way you preserve the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio is to make sure your unit of account is Bitcoin, not the US dollar. Your unit of account should be Bitcoin. That's my view about Bitcoin dominance. I'm excited to see a lot of you guys at the conference this week, Bitcoin Nashville. I'm actually about to head out, like right now. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up. Make sure you guys subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.